Very much. And greetings to everybody. I will just share my presentation. So you can see it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I've been studying like work and play in childhood in Slovenia for some time, and I was also previously looking into children's perspectives. But currently I am working on a project in which I study intergenerational childhood memories of children's participation in work in various subsistence modes in rural area in Slovenia. And I also examine the concept of work as a life-sustaining practice. So I will present some ideas from this project. And so far, 33 research participants participated. They were born from 1940 to 1954. And what I do, I'm like collecting memories in workshops. So it's like through these focus groups, but then also life history interviews. And when I make these interviews, we also go through like family albums of my interlocutors. And I also conduct sensory walks with them in this cultivated landscape where they share memories related to specific places. But it's also meant like, so they show me what they are still actually, what practices they still practice with regard to this agricultural work. And I also did a couple of semi-structured interviews with more like professionals on the land cultivation in Slovenia. So in Slovenia, I think what's important, like maybe to emphasize, is that industrialization generally began relatively late, only after First World War, and then more intensively after the Second World War. And even then, when this rural population got employed in industry, it continued to cultivate land for their own consumption and also for additional income. So there was like quite a big segment of population, which I call semi-peasants or like part-time farmers, because they combined waged work and farming. So this predominantly peasant or like semi-peasant society was characterized by self-sufficient agriculture throughout the 20th century, because the activities of farming families were primarily focused on producing sufficient quantities of food for their own consumption. Also, some surpluses were like sold for additional income, and the household was both a place of production and consumption. Also, very important was mutual help and reciprocity among relatives and villagers. This was especially the case for bigger agricultural tasks, such as crop harvest, grape harvest, and this played an important role in the organization of work and also in sustaining social relationships. And usually also 2 or 3 generations lived together, like in the same house with separate households or in close vicinity. And of course, all family members participated in work, including children from an early age. So maybe just a bit like to get also this sense of this contemporary, like the region where I conduct research, because nowadays there are like some bigger family farms who are like also more market oriented. But when I say bigger family farms, actually the majority of farms in Slovenia are family farms, and they are actually quite small. Like in this European context, for example, an average size of agricultural holding in 2016 was a bit less than 7 hectares. And when it comes to livestock, the average was 7.5 heads per household. But I'm also interested in these semi-farming households who mostly produce just for their own consumption. And these would typically have a little bit of everything. So for a bit of vineyard, although recently those who have just for themselves, they're like abandoning vineyards. There's been this trend. Then they would have like an orchard, a field with vegetables. We can see like on the top right. And then closer to home, they would have like all some smaller vegetable gardens. Some would also own domestic animals like chicken, rabbits, cows, sheep. And then there are also little raking stands, to which I will come back later. And very common is also seasonal foraging, for example, for mushrooms, chestnut herbs. Beekeeping, hunting is also quite like common, and each household would typically also own a patch of forest and they would like use they would cut woods for the heating in winter. So these various uses of land also gave the landscape specific look, because these patches of land are usually quite small and fragmented. So it's like, we call this a mosaic or patchy landscape. But in the past, actually, the land was even more varied, and like throughout the 20th century, there has been a trend of the abandonment of land, of cultivated land, and also reforestation. That's like the trend for a really long time now. So if you look at children's participation in work in this agricultural economy, the extent of the children's participation has continually declined across, if you look just at the last 3 generations. But I would say that participation in some kind of agricultural work within this family setting has been a common childhood experience to this day. So for my interlocutors, as I said, like they were born from 1940 to 1990s, work and everyday life, it was not really separate, and children were usually present at all kinds of work. And they learned mostly like this socialization, how they learned all these skills. This went through, they were learning through observation, also play, and then gradual participation. As they got older, they took on more responsibility. So this work was predominantly subsistence oriented, but also I would say very much embedded in these social relationships of reciprocity and care. But I'm also interested in how through participation in work within these small scale farming households, children have also been entering in relationships with non-humans, so with plants, animals, soil, and also the landscape itself. And I refer here to Anna Zink and understanding of work as central activity, which places people in the social world of other living things. So if we just look at domestic animals, because these families, they would typically have like 2 to 5 cows and 2 oxen or a horse for working animals. That was like before mechanization of agriculture, which in this region typically started like in the 70s or maybe late 60s. And then they also had like some pigs, sheep, chicken, rabbits, and these animals, of course, they were like used for subsistence to consume, also as working animals, or they were like fed to be sold for an extra income. But and children were like also typically involved in taking care of the animals, but these animals were also children's companions, as can be also seen from the family albums. So as I observed, if I like now go to these childhood memories, as I observed among like my interlocutors, memories related to work in childhood were often like also shared spontaneously among relatives and neighbors. And these stories also point to the entanglements of human and non-human actors who inhabit the common environment, but also to how with this changing nature of work, with this mechanization and all these things, the landscapes have been changing as well. So I will use 2 stories to illustrate this. In this first story narrated by Vesna, who was born in 1969, we can observe the entanglements of food production, domestic animals, and plants. And she said, her story went like this: it was winter and lots of snow. We smoked sausages from the whole village. The best smoke was from juniper. My parents told me that when I get home from school, I should go to the little lake, like to the forest, and chop some juniper and bring it home. I could barely walk in the snow. I cut down a large juniper and tried to bring it home. I couldn't carry it because it was too big. What now? I went home without it. While walking, I remembered the solution. The ox Liska will help me. In the stable, I untied Liska, put a yoke on him, and I also took the string for tying the juniper. I tied the juniper and returned home with Liska. During this time, my parents noticed that I was not at home, and the barn was empty too. So there was complete confusion and panic. They were looking for me and the ox all over the village. Before nightfall, I appeared with Liska and the juniper. It was not clear to them, like to the parents, how I could untie and harness the ox, as I was too small and had never done this. I was 8 or 10 years old. And she said like they couldn't believe how brave she was. But then the others who were present when she was telling this story commented that it was actually the ox that led her, not the other way around. So the agency was attributed to the ox, the working animal to which families heavily depended before the mechanization of agricultural work. But this story also takes us to a litter raking stand. These litter raking stands were like special patches of land where in late autumn farmers cut bracken for bedding for cattle. Although litter collecting was practiced also in other parts of Slovenia where it was more common that farmers were collecting leaves, these specific litter raking stands that we can see on the pictures with these scarcely grown birch trees and bracken can only be found in this region. So according to one explanation, this also gave a name to this region because it's called Bila Krajina. This means white landscape because of the birch trees. And these stands were formed due to the entanglement of human activity, animals activity, and also the composition of the soil itself. Because the soil in this region is in many parts relatively scarce and shallow, it's quite stony and also acid. So people formed these stands in patches of land where the soil as such was not suitable for cultivated fields. But then as they removed these basic nutrients from the forest every autumn, they made it even more acid. So both birch tree and bracken can survive on acid soils, and they gradually replaced the original white hornbeam and oak forests. And also in early spring, these stands were also used for mowing and grazing. So livestock was grazing, and it also destroyed some of the bracken, which emerges in late April. And then in the autumn, when they cut bracken, they also occasionally cut some of the young trees. So the farmers maintained this balance of these sparsely scattered birch trees with this undergrowth consisting mostly of common bracken and common heather, but also here we find also Scotch pine and hornbeam and bush species in the undergrowth such as buckthorn, hazel, juniper, and blackthorn. And also these stands were also rich with fungi because the chemical composition of soil played an important role. And among very common childhood experiences of my interlocutors was actually also collecting mushrooms. And then they dried them and sold them to agricultural cooperatives. This was mainly back in Yugoslavia. And then when children, when they collected these mushrooms, then they also get to spend this money. So it was theirs money, but actually they use it usually to buy school books. And another very common childhood experience was also herding cows. This was for the interlocutors born between 1940s and 1970s. And children were supposed to take care of the cows and make sure that they don't go to the fields and make some damage like with the crops. But they also use this time for playing and socializing with other children, also for exploring the surroundings. For example, boys, they were looking for bumblebees' nests to steal their honey. They also set traps for dormice, and they also, some even recalled that they were trying to catch a fox, albeit unsuccessfully. And children also had to take cows to ponds to drink water. Here below is an example of such pond. But children also, they also use these ponds they were swimming in there, they were fishing, they were catching tadpoles, making wooden water mills and so on. So the story related to taking care of the cattle while it was grazing and the ponds, narrated by Simon who was born in 1953, tells how they were also using these ponds to take a bath, but then the neighbor, one of the neighbors was very mad about it because these ponds were primarily intended for to be for the cows, and when the children were bathing in there, they were mixing the water and it became really slurry, so the cows didn't want to drink it. But these ponds, which actually gather rainwater, they're typical in this karst landscape because this region, it's karst soil. What's typical for karst is that there's not a lot of surface water, so most of the precipitation water that falls on the surface actually sits directly underground. And and this impermeability of the ponds was actually maintained by the cattle themselves, because they were like, when they came to drink and they trampled the clay at the bottom, they were like pressing it and it became like the water stayed there. But then since the 1970s, when the farming practices changed and also the farmers started to abandon cattle, these ponds were not used anymore. So when they were not used anymore, they gradually became overgrown. And we can see here this picture about, it's a picture of this pond, where it used to be pond, where Simon was taking his cows and taking a bath with his friends. So these childhood memories of participation in work in domestic agriculture and economy, they also reveal this interweaving of memory, embodied experience, and sociality, which is situated both in social and natural environment. So through work, children inhabited the environment far beyond the surroundings of their home, because these vineyards, pastures, litter raking stands, cultivated fields, they were scattered like quite apart and far. And they shared also this environment with animals and plants. So I gave these two examples of ponds and litter raking stands as two ecosystems which were shared by children and non-humans, but both of these ecosystems were also shaped by human work, animals, and plants across generations. So these examples also point to the constant interaction among human and non-human actors, and also to the work of nature as collective distributed undertaking of humans and non-humans acting to reproduce, regenerate, and renew a common world. So after the abandonment of agricultural practices related to ponds and these litter raking stands, just as it happens in Slovenia with other abandoned cultivated landscapes, they become overgrown. And this forest recovery, for example, in these litter raking stands, it happens in approximately 40 years. So one might just walk past these patches of land and see forest. Yet with memories attached to these places, they acquire new meaning and they become objects worthy of attention, revealing also perceptual skills and environmental knowledge of my interlocutors, which they acquired through work-play continuum, I would say, because I think when they were like working, this play was also quite merged. So maybe I will finish here, and yeah, I welcome these questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara.